The cinematic philosopher Ferris Bueller once said that life moves pretty fast, and if you don't stop and look around once in a while, you might miss it. The ever-growing collection of writings on this page are from my life. Moments spread out over a quarter of a century when I've stopped and looked around once in a while and wrote it down. Not years later and filtered through rose or gray-colored glasses. It's what I saw in that moment. It's what I didn't miss.
All God's creatures. We first noticed him in the late summer. Or rather, my wife did, as she opened our patio door and shrieked as she came face to face and eye to eye with an 8-legged creature seemingly floating in front of her face. No, Nadia's never been terribly fond of bugs, with the possible exception of the praying mantis, which she finds fascinating, though hopefully not for the female's post-mating penchant for devouring the male. But in a house where there are more bug catchers than dollhouses, being squeamish is not an option, and she knows a cool arachnid when she sees one. Our children and I soon crowded around and examined the nearly invisible web hanging across the door and the spider that was darting up the center to the safety of the overhang above. The orb web was both intricate and enormous, starting at the top of the outside of our sliding glass door and spreading several feet to the side and several more feet below. The spider itself was striking. Its midsection was marble-sized, and the combination of its black and yellow and orange coloring and its long, thick legs gave it an exotic and dangerous look.
I got him!
We were just getting ready to sit down for dinner, so we left the web alone for the moment, not knowing just how far-reaching that decision would be. Our dining room table was a mere 5 feet from that door, and halfway through that meal, our family banter was interrupted by the action outside. We watched with fascination as a ladybug hovered outside the window, attempted to land on the glass, and unwittingly landed smack in the middle of the web. Whap! In less time than it takes me to snag a green bean on my fork, that spider covered the 18 inches between it and its prey, looking like a fearsome fireman descending a hidden pole. We all sat transfixed as we watched through the glass as it balanced itself on 4 outer legs, held onto the ladybug with 2 inner legs, while using yet 2 other legs to spin its fresh meal into a little sack, spinning the bug over and over and over again like a rotisserie chicken in super fast motion. We were hooked. From that day on, that spider became a summer and autumn-long companion, getting at least as much attention in our house as our more conventional pet dog and cat. Oh, we're not so eccentric that we named him Charlotte, and no, we don't claim that he speaks to a pet pig or writes words on his web. Of course not. First of all, we don't have a pet pig. And second, his name is Webster. Okay, the sound I imagine in my head now is the sound of readers quickly calling DCFS to get the children out of this house. But I will ignore that sound like I ignore all the other voices in my head and continue the story. For the rest of that season and well into the next, each night around dinner time as we would set up for our mealtime, Webster would come out and set up for his own, repairing the holes in the previous night's web and then sitting in the corner waiting for his meal to arrive. He had chosen the placement of his home well, setting up shop directly across from our outside patio light, and we all quickly became willing partners in his nightly feast. Added to our ritual of pre-meal prayers was the new ritual of turning the light on for Webster, and he rewarded us each night with a private nature show. As the dusk would settle outside, the illuminated light would attract a parade of insects that were drawn so intently to the light that they wouldn't notice the spider's nearby trap until it was far too late. And unlike that first night, Webster would no longer spook and scatter when we gathered around to inspect his handiwork. Rather, he seemed to somehow understand the semi-symbiotic relationship that had been established. And he would go about his spider business boldly, as if there weren't 6 giant faces staring at him from all angles. Like just about everything else in a life with 4 curious children and 2 parents with a bent towards education, Our fascination with our eight-legged neighbor became an opportunity to talk about lessons of life. Some were obvious lessons, like the lessons of real estate, location, 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 and of perseverance and faith, build it and they will come, and of choices and consequence, cue the ladybug's perspective, and even the parable of the sparrow. Yes, God does care even for a little spider, so no, we don't have to bring it inside out of the rain. But there were other more unexpected lessons, such as a stormy night when a strong wind and rain caused Nadia to glance outside to see how Webster was holding out. "Look at that," she exclaimed, and I came over to see the little spider hanging to the very center of his rain-splattered web, while the wind gusts were blowing it in and out and back and forth with such force that it wasn't clear whether he would succumb first to motion sickness or to the inevitable crashing of his body against a house 2 blocks away once the web gave way to the tornado-like conditions. Note, this is where an accomplished writer pulls out a fancy literary or cultural reference to cleverly cement an image in the reader's head. But hey, we're just talking about a spider story here, so think of Gilligan on the storm-tossed minnow. We'll call it good. "Webster, better get off that web and under the ledge," I implored him. And yes, DCFS should be here any time now. But he just hung there, riding the wave on his web over and over and over again. "I guess he trusts his web more than our house," Nadia said. The next morning when we came downstairs, the web was tattered and torn, but somehow still intact. And there was that spider up in its corner as if nothing had happened. Nadia later summed up the lesson as, if you always do your best, then you can trust the work of your hands, which was far more positive than the old "don't build your house on sand" parable I had expected to pull out that morning. But then that's the beauty of writing morals with the perspective of history. I could go on, but I'm getting a little embarrassed to be writing so long about things I've learned from a spider. We said goodbye to Webster in mid-October, the night of the first hard freeze. There was a strong wind out of the north that night, and the temperatures were falling fast. The kids all knew that a harsh lesson of nature was imminent. We all looked out the door for our little amigo. He had been languishing these last few days, and his web had suffered from neglect for the first time. On this night, though, there was no web and no spider to be seen. "Where is he?" asked Nadia, whose previously rational personality had clearly and finally crossed the line with her family's. There was silence, and I got ready to break the news that we had likely already seen the last of our patio pal. My half-formed eulogy was interrupted, however, by a sudden yell of, "There he is!" from my oldest and clearly excited son, Noah. And sure enough, off to the side near ground level was Webster, hanging onto a single web string that led straight up. He was flying back and forth like a trapeze artist in a harsh wind, slowly climbing up the strand in a clear struggle against the elements. The wind was so strong and the web string so thin that it looked at first glance that he was flying unaided back and forth at breakneck speeds in front of us, only inches off the ground. "He's heading for the light," shouted Benjamin, my next oldest son, and sure enough, it seemed like the little spider was making one last fight for life in an Indiana Jones-like stunt against all odds. For the first time, he was seeking refuge on the same lamp edge that had served as a beacon for so many of the bugs that had ended up on his nightly menu. The wind was too strong, however, and we could all see that his prospects weren't good. Instinctively, I slid open the door and stepped outside, positioning myself and my cupped hands between the howling wind and our little compadre. "Way to go, Dad!" I heard from inside, and as the now partly sheltered Spidey string began to whip less violently in the wind, we watched and cheered as Webster accelerated up to the ledge of the light above and settled in the corner at just the right distance from both the lamp's heat and the wind's fury. There was something about that moment that was as exciting and exhilarating as any action-adventure scene in the movies, and we went to bed that night with a strange feeling of contentment. The next day, there was frost on the windows, and there was no sign of insects or spiders or webs. We checked again at dinner time, but there was no sign of Webster, and the patio door was still conspicuously clear as we headed up to bed that night. We all knew in our hearts that this strange little relationship was likely over, and this became more likely as that week moved along with a now frostless but still webless window. And then, 3 days after that first temporary frost, he was back. There was no mistaking his markings, his size, and his location. No prodigal son ever had a finer welcome back than that little spider did on the morning he returned and began rebuilding his web on the barren glass. We wondered where he'd been for 3 long, cool days, how he'd survived, and how long he would last as we headed towards bigger chills ahead. Yes, it's strange to ask those questions about a spider, and stranger, yes, to care about the answers. But perhaps this leads us to 2 profound truths. First, perhaps the fight to survive and the yearning for home is placed in all of God's creatures, and not just kidnapped collies and Hollywood heroes. And second, perhaps the DCFS docket is just plain full right now, and they just haven't had time to come and take us away. Either way, when they do come, we'll be easy to find. Our patio light is on.